Chapter 6. Days of Triumph.
Touring days, what ages it seems to be.
Since the landlady of Norwich served a mouse up in the porridge
and a beetle in the morning tea.
Touring days, alluring days,
far back into the past we gaze.
we used to tip the dresses every Friday night.
And pass it over lightly when they came in tight.
But somehow to us they seemed alright. Those wonderful touring days.
The war had only been over a couple of months when I auditioned for the Rosa Charles Opera Company. I knew very little about the company when I saw the advertisement asking for singers on the card in a newsagent's window. All that I could find out was that it had been established by an American millionairess, Lois Patton Varder, who had come to England immediately after the war had ended to found an opera company. She was, slightly eccentric, and spent most of the fortune that she had inherited from her father on antiques and early 20th century objets d'art. Miss Patton Varder had named the company after her parents, Rosa and Charles, of whom she'd been very fond, and that family spirit seemed to flow throughout the company. I remember meeting her on the day of my audition in most unexpected surroundings. When I arrived at the address given on the card, nobody seemed to know where she was. "Well, she's somewhere in the building, lady," said the porter at the door to the office block, adding, "She always is." After some time, I pushed open a door at the end of one corridor, marked "Keep Out, Private," and found myself in a barn-like building which must have been one of the warehouses. There was a group of people painting scenery, and I went over to the oldest of them, a woman dressed in an old brown coat, and started talking to her to see if I could find out a little more about this curious organisation. I asked her if she liked working for the Rosa Charles, and she said, "Gee, yes," in a pronounced American drawl, which suddenly switched to being very country. This was Miss Patton Varder herself. She auditioned me there and then in the paint shop. I gave her a brief summary of my singing career, and I was just getting to the description of how I joined a Nesto school when she cut in, saying, Okay, stop messing about. Sing me a couple of notes." "What, here?" "Well, you can sing, can't you? It's big enough, isn't it?" I felt there was something of a latter-day Lillian Bayliss about her. I've always felt the same about Evatne, too. So I sang her 2 or 3 high notes, and she said, "You'll do. You're in. Next, please." Well, of course, there was nobody else waiting, so she gave me a paintbrush, saying, "Okay, honey, better start to earn your keep. Get painting this tree." And I started my job with the company. The first really dramatic role that I played with the Rosa Charles was Mad Margaret in Radigo. This happened quite by chance, as it often does with young singers. Vida Peplum, who was then the high mezzo soloist of the company, had been taken rather poorly at the last minute, and I found myself going on in her place. I had seen Vida play the role, and I had seen Radigo as a child, so I was able to draw on my memory for inspiration. But I was terribly nervous and very under-rehearsed. The gentleman who was playing Sir Despard Murgatroyd, the bad baronet with whom Margaret had been in love for years, was Cledwyn Muggershaw, who had a wonderful baritone voice. It was a sort of voice that you could listen to and imagine Tower Bridge opening. It had that special effect. Cledwyn was very good to me. He looked terrifying on stage, but he was sweetness itself before he went on. "Now, Hilda, dear," he told me, "don't be too worried. You'll be wonderful. We're all behind you." "Oh, that's what worries me," I answered timidly. Well, when Margaret makes her first entrance onto the stage, she is young, barefoot, and her clothes are in tatters. She is really in an old wedding dress that she's lived in for years. Poor girl, she's not really mad at all. She's not even deranged. She's just very sad. She fell in love with Despard Murgatroyd when she was very young, but because he inherited the baronetcy, making him the wicked Baron of Radigor, he was required to commit a dastardly crime every day, otherwise something dreadful would happen to him. He just felt that he could not marry her, so he left her at the altar, and she never got over the shock. Well, of course it all ends happily, but I felt the demands put on me by that first entrance more than any other stage entrance I ever made with the Rosa Charles. The company and the papers were full of praise. The Snitterton Bugle said the following day,
Hilda Bracket's performance at the Empire Theatre Snitterton last night was pure madness. Casting can be a major problem for any director, but last night the audience witnessed what can only be described as inspiration, pure and simple. Margaret is a demanding role, and Miss Bracket threw herself into the part with frightening determination, seldom seen in such an inexperienced young singer. Valiantly supported by the other members of the company, she led us through the nightmare of Margaret's opening scene to the final happy conclusion. Catharsis is an emotion that is not usually associated with the works of Gilbert and Sullivan, but last night the stern-faced audience that left the Empire after this performance had not only seen madness at first hand, they had experienced it in a most harrowing way. Cledwyn Muggershaw, as the evil baronet, suggested...
Oh, that made me feel awfully proud, as it was the first professional notice that I had ever received in England. Of course, in later years with the Rosa Charles, I was able to call her Margaret when I was playing roles like Lucia. I've always felt that it was a pity that Maria Callas never played Margaret. I think she would have been excellent in the part. She was good. Difficult, but good. But she was never really ambitious. She never did play any Gilbert and Sullivan. I was terribly lucky to have been given that chance so early in my time with the company, and I did not mind in the slightest when they put me back in the chorus as soon as Vida was fit again. I'd been given my chance to prove myself, and that was all that counted as far as I was concerned. In later years, I looked back to that first night as Margaret with great satisfaction. She has undoubtedly been my favourite role ever since. I had been singing back in the chorus about 6 weeks after Radigor, when, to my delight, I was cast as Frasquita in Carmen. Carmen herself was to be played by the Italian soprano Giulietta Catodrota, who was guesting with the Rosa Charles at great expense for a short season. She had been a pupil of the great but difficult Italian maestro Vestibules, and I think she picked up some of her temperament from her. If she could have saved the dramas for the stage, things would have been easier. But she used to run around backstage before the performance, beating her chest and saying, "I cannot go on, I cannot go on." And then, of course, she couldn't, you see. She'd no breath left. With Carmen, however, we had only just reached the dress rehearsal stage, and the dramas had not yet started in earnest. We were all sitting in the stalls in our costumes, while the orchestra was going through its paces. I had a cardigan, half of my twin set, over my shoulders, and a box of chocolates and my score of Carmen on my lap. Suddenly, a tall, angular girl with glasses, a long plait, banjo and gumboots appeared at the end of my row, and asked if she could come through to the empty seat beside me. So we all stood up to let her come through, and as she passed me, her banjo caught in my chocolate box. I leant forward, and all my noisette creams fell clattering to the floor. There was a big shushing from the pit, and as I bent down to pick them up, the girl stepped on my fingers with one of her enormous Goodyear gumboots. As I looked up at her in agony, she said, "My name is Yvette Mona Montpellier Hinge," to which I replied through gritted teeth, "Well, you'll have to learn to live with it." That was our first meeting. She left a marked impression on me. My fingers still throb to this day in cold weather, and she never offered to pay for my chocolates. Of course she came from a Scottish family, which accounts for a lot, I think. Before joining the Rosa Charles, Evadne had taken her two middle names, Mona Montpellier, and had worked as Mona Montpellier, banjoist. She used to sing well-known pieces and accompany herself on the banjo to earn money. But when this bold venture proved to be over-ambitious, she swallowed her pride, which could not have been easy, and joined the Rosa Charles very soon after its foundation to play small parts and study on the music side. Evatney had come from a very good Scottish family. Her mother had been Maureen McWhirter before her marriage to her music teacher, Hector Hinge. I well remember being shown a photograph of Evatney's father. He was very like Bertrand Russell, and deaf, but apparently he was a very charming man. He was just 17 years older than his wife, and he died sadly when Evatney was only just in her teens, so she does not remember very much about him. Evatney's mother, Maureen, is a charming woman, very well preserved. She is a woman who has reminded me on several occasions of that wonderful actress Brenda de Banzie, who was so good in those Ealing films. Evatney did not speak about her family a great deal in those early years, and I really only came to know them when we both moved to Stockton-Tressill. I know she had a younger sister, Lavinia, with whom she never exactly saw eye to eye, and I also knew there was a great tragedy in her life, the mysterious disappearance of her twin brother, Lester. Lester was deaf, in the other ear from Evatney, and had left home when he was 17 to run away to sea. Nothing has ever been heard of him since, and Evatney still does not discuss the subject, even after all these years. She used to go down to the sea frequently while she was at home, and put a message inside the bottle in the hope that one day it might reach Lester. They did a roaring trade in ginger beer whenever Evatney was with her family. Even today, she's only to see the name of a well-known building society, and she goes completely cold. If we are in the car, and I catch sight of the advertisement or the sign, I veer off very quickly. Well, it's caused one or two minor mishaps, but better that, I feel, than the harm it might cause Evatney in later years. We struck up a friendship straight away. There was a terrific rapport musically. I wanted to sing all the great roles, and Evatney wanted to direct all the great operas. The Rosa Charles toured a great deal in those early years. Evatney and I actually met at the Empire Theatre, Snitterton, which was a lovely old theatre, but like so many others, has sadly disappeared. After that production of Carmen, we did Aida the following week, in repertory with Iolanthe. Well, somebody had the marvellous idea of doubling upon the costumes, but both Evatney and I questioned the wisdom of dressing the citizens of ancient Egypt as peers of the realm. But we all have to learn. The Rosa Charles was a wonderful company to work with. We shall never see its like again. We made many dear friends while we were with them, and met a number of others in the company as well. I grew very fond of a contralto called Jean Batkin. She was a, big girl with a very nice voice. She was a bit of a giggler, however, and in later years we had one or two problems with her. I remember when Evatney had taken over the orchestra, and we were doing Hansel and Gretel. Jean had been cast as the witch. I was playing Hansel, a trouser role in Lederhosen, and my Gretel was Dodie Bantock. It had been decided at one of the production meetings that the gingerbread house that features in Act 2 should be as realistic as possible, and Evatney insisted that it should be covered with real sweets. Now, this proved to be a serious miscalculation for Jean, who got so bored waiting in the wings started to eat the pieces of cut-up Mars bar that had been secured to the house with syrup. Dodie and I would come on, see the house, and stand back in amazement, and then we would start eating pieces of it, hence the sweets. I must admit that it was difficult trying to sing with a stomach full of Mars bar, but Evatney was very insistent on this point. Well, one night Jean was standing in the wings with Nunton Oddstock, another dear friend of ours. He was 6'2", 14 stone, and a beautiful dancer. He was very light on my feet. He and Jean were listening to Act 1, and must have absent-mindedly started eating the pieces of Mars bar. Of course, they were both very big, and had jolly good appetites, and by the time it came to the scene change, the house was wheeled on, and there was not a sweet on it. Vera Thomas was another tower of strength in the chorus of Rosa Charles. She was not ambitious. which is just as well, because in any production there are only so many parts for so many people, and naturally some of us got bigger parts than others. Now, if we were lucky, that was that, and I was lucky. I had a lot of big parts, in fact. I eventually ended up playing all the leads, but I didn't mind at all. I put on a brave face and loved every minute of it. On the male side of the company, there were many very amusing men, and some quite good singers. There was Warrington Barrowstock, a fine baritone, with a penchant for light ale, which did nothing to improve his voice. Merton Pinkney, who used to take the bets round to the nearest bookie, and dear Cledwyn Muggershaw, who came from a very good family, and who resembled me in so many other ways. The one man in the Rosa Charles who neither Evadne nor I had any time for was Courtney Pines, the company secretary. He became rather enamoured of Dodie Bantock, whereupon they left the Rosa Charles and formed a double act called Bantock and Pines. She sang, and he accompanied her on the bassoon. She never had a strong voice, and he always had sticky fingers. I don't think they ever really made a go of it on their own. Courtney was tall and gaunt, whereas Dodie was short with auburn hair. They must have looked a strange couple on the stage, and that might have been part of the reason that they did not stay in the business for very long. The last time I heard of them, they were running a rock and gift stall in Bournemouth. I do not think she was singing any more, though the CM might have improved her voice. No catalogue of the personalities in the Rosa Charles would be complete, however, without a mention of our devoted and tireless wardrobe assistant, Maud Bullitt. Oh, Maud had been brought up in a little Suffolk village called Stackton Treshill. She adored sewing, and she could do wonderful herringbone stitches on anything. She became a wonderful friend to Evadne and me in those early days, and she has stuck to us ever since. Maud was willing to turn her hand to anything. I remember once during a run of Princess Ida, she went on stage as one of the Daughters of the Plough, which was very suitable in a way, especially as she did not have to sing. A violent epidemic of flu had swept through the chorus, and in Patience, which we were performing in repertory with Ruddigore, the 20 lovesick maidens were reduced to 6. Evadne, who was conducting, had to wear a scarf in the pit, which meant that she did not wear her evening dress either, but one could not afford to be too fussy when her health was at stake. Oh, that was the same evening when the door of the pit swung and hit her on the backside just after she'd walked past the front row, and she turned round to say a few sharp words to the man sitting immediately in front of the door. Maud was always flatteringly attentive to me. She was always insistent that the drugget was laid from the wings to my dressing room to save my lovely costumes, which made Evadne envious, because nobody ever put out the red carpet for her. However, Evadne is by nature a very forgiving person. She just needs understanding. She left the company for a brief period to complete her degree, and in the meantime I graduated to playing all the leads and was eventually offered a seat on the Board of Governors, which I accepted. Evadne returned in the summer of 1946, flushed with success, and bearing the title of Doctor. She is now Dr. Evadne Mona Montpellier Hinge, PTH, LRAM. The PTH stands for part-time herbalist. Well, it was one of the options on her music course. But she became fascinated with the subject, and is still one of only 3 registered part-time herbalists in the United Kingdom. She came back to the Rosa Charles as assistant musical director to Herbert von Twinsetman. However, it was only a matter of weeks before she was dramatically elevated to the post of musical director of the Rosa Charles. Poor Herbert was terribly absent-minded, and never really looked where he was going. He was coming out of the stage door one night, clearly with his mind on other things. He hit the bar of the door that said push bar to open, but instead of one side opening, the whole door fell out completely. Herbert followed the door, landing on the slippery fire escape that had been saturated in the recent downpour, and fell all the way down 2 flights of iron steps, baton in hand. He never conducted again, which was tragic. As soon as Evadne heard what had happened to him, she came into my dressing room and said, "Hilda, looks as though I'll be conducting tomorrow." She's always been very quick to spot these things. We realised that now there was an opportunity to make all the changes to the company that we had dreamt about previously. Evadne was determined to liven the company up, and the week after she took over, we did the ring cycle at the Lyceum at Crewe, immediately followed by a season of the dancing years in Edinburgh. Of course, many of the company were tired, but they appreciate the changes that we were trying to make. 1947 brought me the most thrilling surprise, my damehood. I remember waking up one morning to find a heavy decal-edged envelope lying in the hall. Inside there was a crested piece of paper saying that I was commanded to appear at Buckingham Palace, and that in a New Year's honours list I was to be made a Dame of the British Empire for my services. Oh, I couldn't believe it. I was absolutely overwhelmed. I dashed into Evadne's room and said, "Oh, look at this." She didn't say very much, which was not unusual first thing in the morning, but I did think it was rather peculiar when she went out shopping at 7:45, since the shops did not open until 9. In a way, it was slightly ironical that I should have been made a dame. My parents were titled, of course, and we children had always been the honourables, so the new distinction, flattering as it was, came as far less of a change to me than it might have done to anyone else. Well, Evadne, for instance. The Brackets always wore their honours lightly. Everybody in the company was terribly excited, although they only found out in the papers. Evadne kept the secret very well, and did not breathe a word to a soul. In fact, I do not recall her ever commenting on my damehood. My parents were very pleased too. Mother offered me her furs, which I had never worn before, but which I have adored ever since. I decided to wear my pearls, which were very much a part of me then, and a nice tea frock. The only problem was my hat, but here Maud stepped in by suggesting a woman called Lillian Malmsby, who made the most beautiful hats. Mother thought that the hat I chose made me look too old, but I loved it. It was dark brown, and I have always liked browns. It had one plume at the back and a lovely velvet bow. It didn't hide my face, and I thought it was absolutely right for the occasion. There was only one slight blemish to an otherwise perfect day. The King and Queen, whom I'd last met at my presentation at court as the Duke and Duchess of York, had been unexpectedly called away to Scotland, and the Princess Royal was standing in their place. Oh, she was a charming lady, but I was slightly disappointed that I did not have the opportunity of meeting the King and Queen. Well, I'd looked forward to congratulating them. They'd done so well. Little did I imagine then that in later years I would have the honour of meeting their eldest daughter, our own dear Queen. Although 1947 began with great jubilation at Bracket Towers, it ended on a note of deep sadness, with my father's tragic death just before Christmas. A large group of us had gathered at the Towers to prepare for a big party that was being given on the 20th, the Saturday before Christmas. Father was in a very jolly mood. He always did liven up at Christmas time when his family were gathered all around him. He'd been given the recipe for a new punch, which he insisted on trying a couple of days before the party. So, on the Thursday evening, he asked Cork to prepare a sample, which we all thought was terribly good. It was so good, in fact, that Cork had to go and prepare 2 more samples in the course of the evening. It must have been quite late when we decided to play charades. Mother, who was feeling very tired, said, "I'll sit back and watch you children play with your father." She always called us children, even though both Gil and Elspeth were married, and I was a dame. When it came to my father's turn, he seemed to have a sudden idea, and he dashed up the stairs to the landing and began to loosen my great-grandfather's ceremonial sword that was hanging on the wall. I think, through an unfortunate mixture of too much punch and an expansive movement, he loosened the sword too suddenly, which caused it to swing round on its fastenings and fall out of the scabbard, pinning my poor father to the bathroom door. I think things were too late even then, but Gil dashed forward to help. hit his foot against one of the electric points, and blew the main fuse in the house so that all the lights went out. When Cork appeared with some candles, it was evident that father had died as he had lived, by the sword. It was a fitting, if unexpected end, for an old soldier. Mother took father's death very well. Oh, she missed him terribly at first, but she is a woman of great character who has learned to come to terms with things as they are. She never thought of marrying again, although she was still young enough, and many men would have been happy to have spent their declining years with her. But she took great relief from having the family near her, and still lives at our house at Bracket Basing, now that Gil and Nan live in the Towers. One of the first things that Gil did after father had died was to investigate the mysterious little room. In fact, it did not reveal much to clear the question of father's close secrecy. All that we found in there was father's desk, which only seemed to contain a candle, a ruler, a pen, and a selection of school nibs. On the windowsill there was a decanter with the remains of some port and an upturned glass. The one unusual item we found was a lady's dressing gown hanging on the back of the door. Well, nobody knows to whom it belonged or how it got there. It was quilted, and inside there were a pair of lace gloves, but those were the only clues that we had. Mother thinks that it might have belonged to Granny Bracket, or someone he knew before he married. But she must have been a tall woman, whoever she was. However, her identity has been a mystery ever since. I tried to get home more often after father died, but life with the company was becoming increasingly hectic with Evatney in charge, and it was not always easy to get away. The repertoire had become far more varied, of course, but we used to stick to a regular pattern. We put the heavier shows on in the winter. Macbeth was always in the first week of December. The Gilbert and Sullivan season, on the other hand, was always in spring, which is the most suitable time of the year for their work, in my opinion. Verdi was late autumn, when the misty scenes in Force of Destiny were so much more realistic. People would relive what they'd just seen on stage as they fought their way out of the car park. Both Evatney and I felt that it was very important to put on the right show at the right time. Apart from a great variety of shows, we toured a great many theatres. We would play maybe the Sunderland Empire for 3 weeks, then transfer to the Theatre Royal Northampton for 10 days to a fortnight, before transferring to the Empire Snitterton for a 6-week season. I was always fond of Snitterton, because it was so open-minded. Opera and farming blended so well there. The Empire was not a large theatre, but it had a wonderful atmosphere, and there was a big proscenium arch, which is so essential for opera. The major drawback was that the pit was rather small, which meant that some of the orchestra had to be in number 1 dressing room. Well, their sound was brought through with soundboards, and they had to follow Evatney's baton by looking at a complicated system of mirrors. But in spite of the difficulties involved, nobody ever complained. We used to tailor our programme to the area in which we were appearing, and the duration of our stay was dependent on how well we had gone down the year before. If we had been very successful the previous year, we would add an extra week to our visit the next time. If things had not gone as well as expected, we would halve the time. In the 9 years I was with the company, we had some memorable times. One particularly authentic note was struck at the Empire Snitterton, which had a rather loose fly tower. We were performing The Barber of Seville, which has a very dramatic storm scene. Evatney by now was becoming quite well known for her realistic settings, and we were all expecting the terrific flash and bang of the first clap of thunder. However, we were not prepared for the gale blowing outside, which suddenly blew off the top of the fly tower, allowing the rain to lash down onto the stage. Oh, we were drenched to the skin in a matter of seconds, and the water was running in torrents down into the pit, where Evatney kept the orchestra going with admirable sang-froid. It's the only time I've ever really seen her smile. The audience leapt to their feet and applauded for minutes afterwards. We were invariably complimented on our attention to detail after that. We received glowing notices wherever we went. I remember the headline in the Wolverhampton Press the day after we performed Un ballo in maschera, a masked ball, in the costumes for the dancing years. The real costumes had been diverted to Crewe, and Maud had to rush round to Woolworths to buy paper masks for the matinee performance. I was Mickey Mouse, I remember. We went on with the tricorn hats from the gondoliers, determined not to be thrown by minor mishaps like that. I remember Evatney saying to us before the curtain went up, "They can't us hear the music," and we got a wonderful round at the end. I forget exactly what the critics said, except that the performance left them speechless, and they described the costumes as unforgettable. An unforgettable production of Un ballo in maschera, a masked ball, read the headlines the next day. Our digs were always a source of great fun. Evatney and I always preferred digs, although some of the company were never happy unless they were in a flat. We used to share digs with Nunton and Boothby Pagnell, the first cello, but we always went to other people's flats if there was a party going on. I will never forget one Saturday night we spent in Leeds after performing in the Grand. We had all had a few glasses of wine and were having a high old time when somebody started the rumour that we were going to be joined by a new assistant musical director who was due to appear at the party. We all waited expectantly, and suddenly the door burst open, and in walked the most enormous woman I've ever seen. Well, I burst out laughing when I realised it was Nunton. He got into one of Evatney's cardigans and a long black dress, and was carrying Boothby's cello under his arms like a violin. He had a pair of half spectacles on the end of a chain, which looked for all the world like Evatney's. I remember that she left a short time after Nunton's entry. Boothby was the only other one who did not seem to take it too well. I think he must have been worried about his instrument in Nunton's clumsy hands. Well, he did not like having it tampered with, and really no one could blame him. Evatney was very protective about hers. Not all our digs were the same, and there were some that we looked forward to much more than others. There was a woman in Redcar who used to put the fear of God into all four of us whenever we went there. The first time we arrived, there were actually 8 of us altogether, and when she opened the door, she looked at us all and said, "Oh, if I had known there was going to be so many, I'd have opened a tin of salmon." She was very careful with her money. We used to pay 3 shillings a week to use the cruet. It was not long after that run in Leeds that a new girl joined the chorus, and to my surprise and joy, I discovered it was Flavia Checketts, who I had not seen since my coming-out ball. We threw our arms round each other and exchanged knitting patterns. We were so pleased to meet up again. However, Flavia was only with the company for a short time, sadly, because the Rosa Charles disbanded suddenly, a few weeks later, in May 1954. The collapse of a company that had seemed to be on the crest of a wave came as a terrible shock to all of us. I knew that the profits were not large, but Evatney seemed to be coping awfully well with the accounts. Of course, many people might have accused her of extravagance, but those of us who knew her realised how important realism and authenticity were to her. For example, in Iolanthe there was the expense of hiring the prize specimens from the municipal botanical gardens to be met, or not to mention the waterfall, which broke loose one night in Cleethorpes in 1952, and poured into the timpani section. The audiences loved all these things, of course, but they could not be produced for nothing, and we had to spend money. We used to get standing ovations for all our sets, as Evatney tried to explain to Lois Patton Varda, as they faced each other over the dock at the Old Bailey. But, following her losses in Las Vegas, she did not seem very sympathetic to our point of view. She and Evatney spent a couple of days going through the books very carefully, and the following week I found myself with a complete change of programme. We put on the Pirates of Penzance, and I had to sing Mabel 18 times in 1 week, with shows at 2, 5 and 8 o'clock in the evening, and at the beginning of the following week, Evatney and I left. The company disbanded soon afterwards, which came as no surprise for the two of us. I think it had lost Dr. Hinge's meticulous musicianship in the pit, and though it may seem immodest, I think it would be true to say that they would have had difficulty finding another leading lady like myself who would be so willing to take on all those roles. Luck was on our side, though, and before long we were introduced to an agent who thought that he might be able to find us work. Mr. Croxley Mules seemed very obliging, and he offered us a tour of Cyprus for 12 months. 12 months of one-night stands. So we set to work putting together a programme of musical comedy and light opera, and we left by ship from Southampton a fortnight later. That was the first time that Evadne had ever been abroad, and she loved the cruise over. She used to say that if only we were not on the top deck, she could have trailed her hand in the water. She had a wonderful sense of humour, and very long arms. Cyprus was a completely new experience for both of us. Moving from camp to camp every day, we were like ships that passed them a night to the troops we entertained. It was tiring, but the boys loved it. They were a wonderful audience. Many were the times we were called upon to perform on very shoddy erections. However, we appreciated that the boys had sweated for hours to throw these things together at the last minute, and who were we to complain if occasionally they snapped in the middle? If that happened, we knew we had had it, and that was that. We were up against the wall many times, but we coped with it, and the boys were always so appreciative afterwards. One day I was washing our clothes in the spring and smashing them with a stone to get them clean, while a group of soldiers were putting up a marquee for our performance that evening. I was doing an imitation of Jessie Matthews at the time, you know. Oh, for my shoulder goes one, two, and one of the boys, Corporal Dusty Binns, so good at embroidery, asked if I might do it that night. Of course I said that it was at too short notice, but the idea stuck in my mind, and I later incorporated my impression of Jessie into the show. The first time I did it, I was working literally on a plank, nailed to 2 Tizer crates. I did a couple of high kicks, and was just going up for another, when the plank snapped, the 2 ends shot up, and down I went. The front row rushed forward and helped me to my feet so I could get started, and they were all for me carrying on with the dancing. But Evadne told me to just get on with the song, which was not easy with a mouthful of gravel, even though my diction has always been praised. At the end of our year, Cyprus seemed like one long journey from start to finish, punctuated by some songs and a few giggles. We had had a wonderful time out there, but we were both in need of a jolly good holiday when we got home.